So much of the externalization conditioning, and any kind of conditioning really, is set in place by erroneous assumptions. We overlook this as early on in existence, in the more immature stages of our egoic development, without even consciously knowing it, we establish dubious premises that quickly solidify into foundational beliefs that shape our entire view of reality. And if these types of shoed-in assumptions manage to put down roots on firm grounds, which they almost always do, they will be almost impossible to undo. And so imagine the type of quandary this presents. When the kinds of assumptions that one has accepted, hence becoming the potential bedrock of a belief system without any pensive review, are actually false or faulty. This is the beginning of mental slavery, as any false assumption about existence will necessarily have you assigning power to something you are imagining to be outside of yourself. Or perhaps to something you are a part of, or are a byproduct of, as the case may be. But in each and every case, it is voluntary self-disempowerment. And whether it was willful, innocuous, unconscious, or deceptively introduced, matters not. What matters now is that you are anchored to a false position. That becomes the trap to which you remain tethered, which will thereby direct assignments of power to illusions, based on the default designs of this organizational arrangement. This is important to understand, as so much of mental illness, or spiritual sickness, if you will, relies on sustaining ignorance of the truth. But it's totally up to you if you want to break free from the false programming. And this doesn't mean a conversion to an alternative programming. This means a liberation from all programmings and standing in the light of the truth, which needs no support, needs no selling points, needs no shuck and jive nor song and dance. The truth always speaks for itself, while the lie requires contrived narrative. And this is exactly why false existential assumptions are deceptively introduced into your qualitative being. Because despite what most of us would like to believe, there's no way to really force delusion on anyone. Yeah, maybe you think you could try to torture someone into acceptance, but any such acceptance wouldn't be authentic, as anyone would pretend to accept anything just to stop the torture. One does not hold what is not held in the heart. Or maybe you think you could force it into a mind through coercive re-education or brainwashing. But a truly strong mind can never be forced into delusion. If the mind relents, it's due to its own immature strength and the natural tendency to compromise as an easy way out. And sometimes we hear about other such things, like harsh physical circumstances having the ability to break a spirit. But I think Stoicism has pretty much demonstrated this to be a fallacy. Oh yeah, and am I saying this only because I haven't suffered to the proper degree Or did you just give up and are now cynically guising that failure beneath a sneering justification? No. The only way a conditioning can successfully infect a consciousness is by invitation, compromise, or unchecked deceptive infiltration, all of which gain access through avenues of permission. The fact that they are granted entry with permission is exactly why the programming is so grueling to unseat. A belief forced on someone will not be held long. A belief willingly embraced by someone, unconsciously or not, will be defended to often extreme limits. And it's not too hard to figure out why, as the conditioning has become a best friend. The conditioning provides security and comfort to a contrived identity that seeks normalcy, familiarity, predictability, and routine, all of which combine to form a malaise of deprivation, lethargy, and boredom. A sitting duck, aptly primed to be stalked by death itself. So this is why there is so much circumvention of solipsism, a so-called philosophy that's implications could be called to be in accord with the truth. Because if you ever figure your way out of the externalization conditioning, you will inevitably attain power of mind, and then less power will be assigned to the illusions. And if that happens, you will become difficult to control. Hence why they must do everything that they can to stop you. So this brings us upon the subject of epistemological solipsism. What is epistemological solipsism? Epistemological solipsism is a variety of idealism, according to which only the directly accessible mental contents of the solipsistic philosopher can be known. The existence of an external world is regarded as an unresolvable question, rather than actually false. And so this is why I don't consider epistemological solipsism to be all that useful of an application. It's kind of like solipsism light, with the light being spelled L-I-T-E, clarified as such to invoke the correct tone of connotation. Of course, as usual, we note that epistemological solipsism is touted as a variety of idealism, which frames the entire consideration as unrealistic, i.e., existing only in the imagination, desirable or perfect, but not likely to become a reality, which thereby downgrades the significance of the truth that only directly accessible mental contents of a solipsistic philosopher can be known. As if there was some other way for knowns to be accessed by a philosopher. Whether knowledge is acquired directly, indirectly, empirically, or dogmatically matters not, as any possible synthesis or transference of knowledge is only going to be through a mental medium. But then comes the funny part. The existence of an external world is regarded as an unresolvable question rather than actually false. Might this position be more aptly called agnostic solipsism? I guess this position is more interested in upholding the integrity of intellectual honesty rather than standing in the light of the existential truth. It's an interesting position, to be sure, as it teeters on the fence of the truth, afraid to fully commit because it knows it can't prove the truth by the rules that the externalization conditioning demands, and yet, oddly, still seeks to placate and pander to it somewhat by upholding its standards. It's obvious from this that the epistemological solipsist has a lot more work to be done nihilistically, and might prove to benefit from some psychonautical exploration or deep meditation. And so by this epistemological standard, which is actually less solipsistic due to its externalization mindset of an extrinsically existing universe whose qualities can only be known through a set of separated sense organs, epistemological solipsists claim that realism requires the question: assuming that there is a universe independent of an agent's mind and knowable only through the agent's senses, how is the existence of this independent universe to be scientifically studied? Well, that's the thing. Sure, it's a required question for realism, but it's also an equally required question for the epistemological solipsist, who probably never thought to even answer it himself. What is the alternative to knowledge based on the interpretations of the five senses? As a solipsist, the answer should be clear. But let us not forget that what we are dealing with is not so much a solipsist, but rather an externalist who's merely conceded that everything known about the universe is confined to sensory data. Despite admitting the purely mental nature of existence, they are not yet ready to go as far as admitting the universe is completely imaginary, and that reality is a complete production of the mind. And so here we find it. The epistemological solipsist's willingness to take on the false existential assumption, while afraid to commit to the implications of the truth of his own position, in order to satisfy the dictates of physical science, which is completely constructed upon the externalization conditioning. It seems the only thing epistemological solipsism wants to clarify is that objectivity requires an assumption, and as long as this point is understood, it's completely willing to concede to the outlines of the physical model of existence. But why? If it's false, then why take on such an assumption at all? Yeah, I know people don't want to let go of their ideological attachments. People don't want to let go of old physical science. In the same way, they don't want to let go of religion. Oh, sage, they are not the same thing. Yeah, Chuller. That isn't the point. And not what I was saying, anyway. Science may have a bit more credibility than religion, as it does seek to build knowledge on observable phenomena, but it still falls short, as it is founded on a false premise about reality that simply isn't true. The false premise that calls itself realism. Now isn't that some shit? Realism and idealism are both supposedly philosophical concepts equally up for debate. Yet mind-independent reality gets the title of realism, while mind-dependent reality gets the title of idealism. Doesn't it seem that someone wants to slant the favor towards realism? Doesn't it seem that by these types of classifications, one position is being assigned a handicap, while the other is assigned a disadvantage? one should wonder why this is. So it seems that epistemological solipsism doesn't want to posit anything about what so obviously exists firsthand, and instead only wants to concern itself with the claims of knowledge within the illusion. Like a persona in a dream who doesn't want to concern itself with lucidity, but instead wants to make sure that it's clarified with the other personas that any knowledge in the reality is only applicable to the context of the sense perceptions of a subject. That's nice. And while it does stick one toe into the waters of solipsism, it doesn't hardly go deep enough into the truth. And that's because, in the grand scheme, knowledge is irrelevant to the nature of reality. And to uncover and become intimate with the nature of reality doesn't involve learning, study, or the acquisition of knowledge, which I know for many of you presents an impasse that cannot be breached. Hence the reason for the advent of epistemological solipsism, for those willing to explore only so far as it relates to what can be argued in conjunction to claim knowledge and the mind of a subject. So the utility of epistemological solipsism seems to support the maintenance of a general non-committal skepticism that asserts that the truth is only that which can be known directly through the five senses. Other than shattering the usually unchallenged authoritative assumptions of contemporary philosophical realism, what epistemological solipsism achieves is questionable. It isn't conducive towards lucidity. So what function does it serve within delusion? Perhaps merely to make for a more interesting offering of a skeptical doubt to an argument made in philosophical discourse? Perhaps, for isn't that always the M.O. of a skeptic? Not so much to present an argument, but rather just to throw wrenches in existing arguments, and perhaps ridicule them for the sake of entertainment. But I dig the rigors that this places on the externalist. It certainly narrows the borders of what a realist can argue as knowledge, which brings us many intriguing novelty considerations, such as when the epistemological solipsist asserts a classic argument typical for the position, such as, if a person sets up a camera to photograph the moon when he is not looking at it, then at best he can determine that there is an image of the moon in the camera when he eventually looks at it. Logically, this does not assure that the moon itself, or even the camera, existed at the time the photograph is supposed to have been taken. To establish that it is an image of an independent moon requires many other assumptions that amount to begging the question, which means to assume the conclusion of an argument, a type of circular reasoning, which is an informal fallacy, in which an arguer includes the conclusion to be proven within the premise of the argument, often in an indirect way, such as its presence within the premise is hidden or at least not easily apparent. And this really puts the realist in a tight spot, as it also puts the burden of proof on the realist to show how aspects of reality are ontologically independent of our conceptual schemes, perceptions, linguistic practices, and beliefs, of which might not even be possible to demonstrate. Yet, when all is said and done, epistemological solipsism really doesn't go as far as it should, and suspends any assertions that awareness is the primary foundation. So, as it stands, it is merely a position that imposes a standard about what can be accepted as truth within knowledge. And as for answering the question of if a philosopher can only truly know the aspects of his own mind, then how should a philosopher go about studying the universe? It loses its way. For it would rather assume objectivity in the name of science with a stricter standard, rather than follow the implications of the position and discover the accurate premise, which reveals that there really is no universe out there to assume exists objectively in the first place. Lucidity, or awareness of the dream, is revealed through focusing on the source of attention, not through the examination of dream details.